I knew something was wrong when my bank called to ask if I had changed my address without informing them about my account. "No," I said, gripping my phone tighter as I stood in my kitchen in Mesa, Arizona. "I've lived at the same address for 3 years. Why would you think I moved?" The representative on the other end paused. "Mr. Jenkins, we have a change of address notification on file from the United States Postal Service. According to this, you've moved to 4782 Saguaro Ridge Drive." My blood ran cold. That's 2 streets over from me. I absolutely did not file any change of address. Someone's stolen my identity. "I understand this must be alarming," she said professionally. "I'm going to flag your account immediately and send you verification documents to your address on file. You'll need to contact the post office right away." After I hung up, I sat down at my kitchen table and tried to process what was happening. I'm Lucas Jenkins, a 34-year-old software developer who works remotely. I'd bought my house in this planned community 3 years ago, thinking it would be a quiet place to settle down. The homeowners association had seemed reasonable enough at first, but things had gotten progressively worse over the past year when Patricia Brennan became the HOA president. Patricia was the definition of a nightmare neighbor. She was a 52-year-old woman with bleached blonde hair styled in that aggressive bob cut that somehow signaled trouble from a mile away. She had appointed herself the guardian of neighborhood standards, writing violation notices for the most ridiculous infractions imaginable. "Too many flower pots on your porch," violation. "Christmas lights still up on December 26th, violation. She'd even tried to fine my next-door neighbor for having a garden gnome that was supposedly not within the approved decorative guidelines, but this was different. This wasn't a petty fine or a nasty letter. Someone had actively redirected my mail, and I had a sinking feeling about who might be responsible. I grabbed my car keys and drove straight to the post office on Main Street. The building was busy with the afternoon rush, and I had to wait 20 minutes before I could speak to someone at the counter. The clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, listened as I explained my situation. "Let me pull up your account," he said, typing into his computer. His expression grew concerned. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm seeing that a change of address form was filed for your residence on January 15th. That was 3 weeks ago." "I didn't file that," I said firmly. "Can you tell me what address my mail is being forwarded to?" He hesitated. "Sir, this is a serious matter. If someone filed a fraudulent change of address, that's mail fraud. It's a federal crime." "I know. That's why I'm here. Can you reverse it? I can put in an immediate request to cancel the forwarding, but you're going to need to file a report." "Let me get the postmaster." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in a cramped office with Postmaster Gerald Simmons, a balding man in his 60s who took extensive notes as I explained everything. He pulled up the change of address form on his computer and turned the monitor toward me. "Is this your signature?" he asked. I stared at the screen. Someone had forged my signature, and while it wasn't perfect, it was close enough that the automated system had accepted it. "No, that's not my signature. It's close, but look at the way the J curves. I never write it like that." Gerald nodded slowly. "The form was filed online, which requires less verification than an in-person submission. The address it's being forwarded to is 4782 Saguaro Ridge Drive. Do you know who lives there?" My suspicions crystallized into certainty. "Patricia Brennan. She's the president of my HOA." Gerald's eyebrows rose. "Why would your HOA president redirect your mail to her house?" "I have no idea, but she's been harassing me and other residents for months. She's written me up for ridiculous violations, and we've had several confrontations." "Maybe this is some kind of retaliation." Gerald leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Jenkins, mail fraud is investigated by the United States Postal Inspection Service. These aren't mall cops. These are federal agents who take this very seriously. If someone is tampering with your mail, they'll want to know about it. Then let's report it." He pulled out a form. "I'm going to document everything you've told me and submit it to the Postal Inspection Service. In the meantime, I'll immediately cancel the forwarding order and flag your address. You should also file a police report with Mesa PD for identity theft. Do you have any proof that Patricia Brennan filed this fraudulent change of address?" "Not yet," I admitted. "But my mail has been going to her house for 3 weeks. She has to have it somewhere." Gerald gave me a serious look. "Don't confront her directly. If she's committed mail fraud, the last thing you want to do is tip her off before the investigators can build a case. Let the professionals handle it." I left the post office with a case number and a growing sense of dread. 3 weeks of mail had been going to Patricia's house. That included bank statements, credit card bills, tax documents, and who knows what else. What had she been doing with it? When I got home, I called Mesa Police Department and filed a report for identity theft. The officer who took my statement was sympathetic, but explained that unless Patricia actually tried to use my personal information, they couldn't do much beyond documenting the incident. "The postal inspectors will handle the mail fraud angle," Officer Davis told me over the phone. "But keep an eye on your credit reports and bank accounts. If she tries to open anything in your name, we can pursue additional charges." That evening, I sat on my back patio and tried to figure out what Patricia could possibly gain from this. Was she just being vindictive? Was she trying to gather information on me for some reason? Or was there something more sinister going on? My phone buzzed with a text from my friend Marco, who lived 4 houses down. "Dude, emergency HOA meeting tomorrow night at Patricia's house. Mandatory attendance. What did you do now?" I texted back, "Nothing, but I might know what she did." The next morning, I called my bank and credit card companies to freeze everything and request new cards. Then I logged into my online accounts and started checking for any suspicious activity. So far, nothing seemed amiss, but the fact that Patricia had 3 weeks of my financial statements made me extremely nervous. At 6 p.m. the following evening, I walked down to Patricia's house for the mandatory HOA meeting. Her house was the largest in the neighborhood, a sprawling Spanish-style home with meticulous landscaping that she probably used as the standard to judge everyone else's yards. Several other residents were already gathering in her spacious living room, looking as confused and annoyed as I felt. Marco caught my eye and mouthed, "What's going on?" I shook my head. I hadn't told anyone about the mail situation yet. I wanted to see what Patricia did when confronted with a room full of people. Patricia entered from the kitchen carrying a clipboard, dressed in a cream-colored blazer and pearls like she was running a corporate board meeting instead of a neighborhood meeting. Her lips were pressed into that thin line that meant she was about to make everyone miserable. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I know it's short notice, but we have several urgent matters to discuss regarding community standards." I sat in the back row, watching her carefully. She didn't even glance in my direction. She launched into a 20-minute lecture about lawn maintenance, holiday decoration policies, and the new rule about approved paint colors for front doors. The entire time, I kept thinking about my mail sitting somewhere in this house. Was it in her office? Had she thrown it away? Was she reading through my private documents right now? When she finally opened the floor to questions, I raised my hand. Patricia's eyes flickered with something, annoyance maybe or nervousness, before she acknowledged me. "Yes, Lucas. I have a question about HOA authority," I said calmly. What are the legal limits to what an HOA president can do in terms of accessing resident information? Several people turned to look at me with interest. Patricia's smile tightened. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm just curious about privacy boundaries. For instance, would an HOA president have any legitimate reason to redirect a resident's mail to their own address? The room went completely silent. Patricia's face flushed red. That's a very specific and bizarre question, Lucas. Are you accusing me of something? I'm asking a hypothetical question about HOA authority. Marco and several other residents were now watching Patricia with undisguised suspicion. She set down her clipboard with a sharp click. If someone believes an HOA member has overstepped their authority, they're free to bring a formal complaint to the board. Now, unless there are relevant questions about the matters we're actually here to discuss, I suggest we move on. Actually, said Deborah Martinez, a retired teacher who lived across from me, I'd like to hear more about this mail situation. Lucas doesn't usually make accusations out of nowhere. Patricia's jaw clenched. There is no mail situation. Lucas is clearly trying to disrupt this meeting with baseless accusations because he's received several violations for his property maintenance. My property is fine, I said, and I'm not making baseless accusations. I'm simply asking questions about legal boundaries. Questions that you seem very uncomfortable answering. The meeting deteriorated quickly after that. Patricia tried to regain control, but people were now whispering among themselves and shooting suspicious looks in her direction. After another 10 minutes of attempted lecturing, she abruptly ended the meeting and asked everyone to leave. As I walked out, Deborah grabbed my arm. Lucas, what's really going on? I lowered my voice. Someone filed a fraudulent change of address form and redirected my mail to Patricia's house. The postal inspectors are investigating. Her eyes widened. Oh my God, that's a federal crime. I know, and I have a feeling I'm not the only one she's done this to. Marco overheard and came closer. Wait, are you serious? Patricia has been stealing your mail for 3 weeks, I confirmed. I only found out because my bank called me about the address change. You need to check with everyone, Deborah said urgently. If she's doing this to you, she might be doing it to others, especially people she has grudges against. The three of us spent the next hour making calls and knocking on doors. What we discovered made my stomach turn. At least 4 other residents had experienced strange issues with their mail over the past 6 months. Jonathan Wright hadn't received his tax refund check. Melissa Cooper's mortgage statements had gone missing. Frank Romano's credit card had been denied at a restaurant because someone had maxed it out, and he'd never received the fraud alert notices that were supposedly mailed to him. I just thought the post office was being incompetent, Frank said, standing in his doorway with his arms crossed. You're telling me Patricia might have been redirecting all our mail. It's possible, I said. The postal inspectors are investigating my case, but if she's done this to multiple people, this is much bigger than a personal vendetta. Frank's expression darkened. If that woman has been stealing my mail and helped someone destroy my credit, I'm pressing charges. Hell, I'm suing her personally and the HOA. By the end of the evening, we had a list of 6 residents who had experienced suspicious mail issues. I documented everything and sent an email to Postmaster Gerald Simmons with the information. He replied within an hour. This is extremely helpful. I'm forwarding this to the lead inspector on your case. Expect a call tomorrow. The call came at 8 a.m. the next morning. Mr. Jenkins, this is Special Agent Watkins from the United States Postal Inspection Service. I understand you've identified additional potential victims of mail fraud. I need to meet with you and anyone else who's willing to provide statements. Agent Watkins turned out to be a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an air of complete authority. She met with me, Marco, Deborah, Frank, and 3 other residents at my house that afternoon. We sat around my dining room table while she took detailed notes and recorded our statements. Mail fraud is a federal offense punishable by up to 20 years in prison, she explained. If Patricia Brennan has been systematically redirecting mail for multiple residents, we're looking at a pattern of criminal behavior. But I need evidence. Mr. Jenkins, your case is the most recent and best documented. I want to use it as the foundation for a search warrant. What do you need from me? I asked. First, I need you to request your mail forwarding records directly from USPS. Second, I need documentation of any financial impacts this has caused. Bank statements, credit reports, anything that shows harm. Third, I need you to avoid any direct confrontation with Miss Brennan. We don't want her destroying evidence. Frank leaned forward. How long will this take? My credit is ruined because someone got access to my personal information. I understand your frustration, Mr. Romano, Agent Watkins said. But building a solid case takes time. If we rush this, she could walk on a technicality. I promise you, we will be thorough. Over the next 2 weeks, I felt like I was living in a spy movie. Agent Watkins called me regularly for updates. I provided her with documentation of every financial issue I'd experienced since the mail forwarding began. My bank had flagged several suspicious login attempts to my online account from an IP address that wasn't mine. My credit card company had caught a fraudulent charge attempt at a home goods store in Mesa, presumably after someone got my card number from a statement. The most damning evidence came when I requested my full mail forwarding records. The USPS provided me with copies of every piece of mail that had been redirected to Patricia's address over the 3-week period. There were 47 items, including bank statements, credit card bills, a replacement debit card, tax documents from my employer, and even my car registration renewal. This is excellent, Agent Watkins said when I handed her the documentation. And I have more good news. We were able to trace the IP address used to file the fraudulent change of address form. It was filed from Patricia Brennan's home internet connection. So you can arrest her. Not yet. I need to confirm she's actually in possession of your mail. That requires a search warrant, and I'm working on that now. In the meantime, has she contacted you at all? No, she's been avoiding me completely. I think she knows something's up. Good, keep it that way. But Patricia wasn't avoiding everyone else. According to Marco, she had been making the rounds in the neighborhood, asking pointed questions about who had attended that disastrous HOA meeting and what people had said afterward. She'd also sent out an email to all residents announcing that certain individuals were spreading malicious rumors about her and threatening legal action against anyone who defamed her character. Deborah forwarded me the email with a note. She's panicking. This is good for us, right? I wasn't sure if it was good or dangerous. A panicking Patricia was unpredictable. 3 days later, Agent Watkins called me at 6 p.m. We have a search warrant. We're executing it tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. I need you to stay away from your windows and do not, under any circumstances, approach the scene. Understood. Understood, I said, my heart racing. The next morning, I made myself a pot of coffee and sat in my living room with the curtains slightly open. At exactly 8 a.m., 3 unmarked cars pulled up in front of Patricia's house. Agent Watkins and 5 other federal agents got out, along with 2 uniformed Mesa police officers. They walked up to Patricia's door, and Agent Watkins knocked firmly. Even from 2 streets away, I could hear Patricia's indignant shriek when she opened the door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. The agents entered the house, and the door closed behind them. Marco texted me, "Are you seeing this?" "There are federal agents at Patricia's house," I replied. "Yeah, don't go over there. Dude, half the neighborhood is standing outside watching." Of course they were. I grabbed my phone and walked outside, staying on my own property but angling for a better view. Sure enough, at least 20 residents had congregated on the sidewalks, phones out, whispering to each other. Deborah saw me and hurried over. "Is this about the mail fraud?" she asked quietly. "They're executing a search warrant." Her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Good. She deserves whatever happens to her." The search took 3 hours. Agents carried out multiple boxes of documents, 2 computers, and what looked like stacks of unopened mail. Patricia stood in her doorway in yoga pants and a robe, looking absolutely destroyed. Her perfect hair was disheveled, and her face was blotchy from crying. An agent stood beside her, speaking in low tones. When the agents finally left, Patricia went back inside and slammed the door. The crowd of neighbors slowly dispersed, but the neighborhood group chat was blowing up with speculation. I muted it and waited. Agent Watkins called me that afternoon. "We found your mail, Mr. Jenkins, all of it." She had it stored in file boxes in her home office, organized by resident name. "You weren't the only one." "How many people?" 9 residents total. She'd been doing this for at least a year, possibly longer. "We found opened bank statements, credit card bills, tax documents, insurance information, everything." She had detailed notes about each resident's financial situation. I felt sick. Why would she do that? We're still piecing together her motive, but from what we've found so far, it appears she was using the information to target residents for HOA violations and fines. If she knew someone was having financial difficulties, she'd hit them with expensive violations to put more pressure on them. In at least 2 cases, it looks like she was gathering information to potentially use for identity theft. That's insane. It's criminal. Patricia Brennan was arrested this afternoon and charged with 9 counts of mail fraud, identity theft, and possession of stolen mail. She's being held on $50,000 bail. The U.S. Attorney's Office will be prosecuting. I sat down heavily on my couch. What happens now? "We'll need you to testify if this goes to trial. We'll also need formal victim impact statements from everyone affected. In the meantime, the HOA board is being dissolved pending an investigation into whether any other board members knew about her activities." "Did they?" "We don't think so. It appears she was acting alone, but we need to verify that." The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By that evening, every resident knew that Patricia had been arrested for federal mail fraud. The neighborhood group chat turned into a chaotic mix of shock, vindication, and anger. People who had been fined or harassed by Patricia came forward with their own stories. The scope of her manipulation became clearer with each revelation. She'd used personal financial information to time violations perfectly. When Jonathan Wright had been between jobs, she'd hit him with a $3,000 fine for unauthorized landscaping changes. When Melissa Cooper was dealing with a medical emergency, Patricia had threatened legal action over a fence height dispute. She'd been systematically weaponizing people's private information to maintain control over the neighborhood. Frank Romano organized a meeting at his house 3 days later. 27 residents showed up, filling his living room and spilling out onto his patio. The anger in the room was palpable. "Patricia Brennan terrorized this neighborhood for over a year," Frank said, standing in front of the fireplace. "She violated our privacy, stole our mail, used our personal information against us, and made our lives miserable." I don't know about all of you, but I want to make sure she faces the maximum consequences for what she did." Everyone nodded in agreement. Deborah raised her hand. "What about the HOA itself? She was acting as president. Doesn't that make the HOA liable?" "I've been in contact with a lawyer," Frank said. "We may have grounds for a class action lawsuit against the HOA for failing to provide adequate oversight. But first, we need to make sure the criminal case against Patricia is airtight." I spoke up. Agent Watkins said they need victim impact statements from everyone who was affected. The stronger our statements, the harder it is for her to get a plea deal or reduced sentence. Over the next week, all 9 direct victims of Patricia's mail fraud worked with Agent Watkins to prepare detailed statements. I documented every financial issue, every moment of stress, every hour spent dealing with banks and credit agencies because of her actions. My statement ended up being 12 pages long. Agent Watkins told me that Patricia's lawyer was trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the U.S. Attorney's Office wasn't interested in being lenient. With 9 victims, extensive documentation, and clear evidence of premeditation, they had an extremely strong case. "She's looking at serious prison time," Agent Watkins explained during one of our calls. "Mail fraud carries up to 20 years per count, and she's facing 9 counts. Even with a plea deal, she's probably looking at a minimum of 5 years in federal prison." "What about restitution?" I asked. "That'll be part of the sentencing. She'll have to pay back everyone she harmed, plus penalties and fees." "Between the criminal restitution and the civil lawsuit your neighbors are pursuing, she's going to be financially destroyed." It felt surreal. A year ago, I'd moved into this neighborhood thinking Patricia was just an overzealous busybody. Now she was facing federal prison time for orchestrating a complex mail fraud scheme. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after her arrest. All 9 victims were asked to attend, and we sat together in the federal courthouse in Phoenix, presenting a united front. Patricia was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, looking 20 years older than she had 2 months ago. Her expensive hair and makeup were gone, replaced by gray roots and a gaunt, exhausted face. Her lawyer argued that she had been under stress from her divorce, that she'd made poor decisions, that she deserved leniency. The prosecutor methodically presented the evidence: the file boxes full of stolen mail, the detailed notes about residents' financial situations, the pattern of targeted harassment, the attempted fraudulent charges on credit cards. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened impassively. When Patricia's lawyer finished his plea for leniency, the judge turned to Patricia. "Miss Brennan, you held a position of trust in your community. Instead of using that position responsibly, you violated the privacy and security of 9 families. You stole federal mail, which is one of the most serious crimes a civilian can commit. You used personal information to manipulate and intimidate your neighbors. I see no reason to show leniency." The judge denied bail reduction and set a trial date for 4 months away. As Patricia was led out of the courtroom, she didn't look at any of us. Her shoulders were slumped in defeat. In the parking lot afterward, Frank gathered everyone together. "She's done. Even if she somehow beats the federal charges, which she won't, the civil lawsuit will bury her. We're taking back our neighborhood." And we did. The HOA was temporarily dissolved while a management company was brought in to handle basic functions. The neighborhood held elections for a new board, and this time, everyone paid attention to who they were voting for. Deborah was elected president, with Marco as vice president. Their first act was to eliminate about 80% of Patricia's ridiculous rules and regulations. The trial happened in September. I took 2 days off work to testify, and my testimony lasted over 4 hours. The prosecutor walked me through every detail of how I discovered the fraud, the impact it had on my life, and the evidence I'd gathered. Patricia's lawyer tried to suggest I was exaggerating, but the documentation was overwhelming. All 9 victims testified. Jonathan Wright broke down on the stand describing how he'd nearly lost his house because of Patricia's harassment during his unemployment. Melissa Cooper explained how she'd missed critical medical bill payments because her mail was being stolen during her cancer treatment. Frank Romano detailed how it had taken him 8 months to rebuild his credit after someone had used his stolen information to open fraudulent accounts. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Patricia Brennan was found guilty on all counts: 9 counts of mail fraud, 5 counts of identity theft, and multiple counts of possession and destruction of stolen mail. The sentencing hearing was in November. I attended along with the other victims. The judge had read all of our victim impact statements, and her expression was grave as she addressed Patricia. "Miss Brennan, I have presided over many cases in my career, but I am particularly disturbed by yours. You systematically violated the privacy and trust of your neighbors for over a year. You used their most sensitive personal information to manipulate and control them. You caused financial harm, emotional distress, and damaged the sense of security that people deserve to feel in their own homes. This was not a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was calculated, sustained criminal behavior." She sentenced Patricia to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. Additionally, Patricia was ordered to pay over $200,000 in restitution to the 9 victims, covering financial losses, credit repair costs, legal fees, and emotional distress. Patricia's lawyer requested that she be allowed to remain free pending an appeal. The judge denied the request. Patricia was taken into custody immediately. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It had been 9 months since I first discovered my mail was being redirected. 9 months of stress, investigation, documentation, and legal proceedings. But it was finally over. The neighborhood returned to normal gradually. The new HOA board under Deborah's leadership focused on actual community building rather than petty enforcement. They organized block parties, maintained common areas, and handled disputes with common sense rather than power trips. The atmosphere in the neighborhood completely transformed. About 6 months after Patricia's sentencing, I was sitting on my back patio with Marco and Deborah, grilling burgers and enjoying the mild Arizona spring evening. "You know what I realized," Marco said, taking a sip of his beer. "Patricia spent so much time trying to control everyone that she destroyed herself. If she'd just been a normal neighbor, none of this would have happened." Deborah nodded. "Power corrupts. She got a little bit of authority as HOA president and lost her mind. The scary part is how long it went on before anyone caught her. If my bank hadn't called me, I might never have known," I admitted. "She could have kept doing it for years." "Well, she'll have 8 years in federal prison to think about her choices," Marco said. "I still can't believe she thought she'd get away with it. People like Patricia always think they're smarter than everyone else," Deborah said. "That's their downfall." The civil lawsuit wrapped up a few months later. Patricia's assets, including her house, were liquidated to pay the restitution and additional damages. The HOA's insurance covered the rest. Every victim received compensation for their financial losses and emotional distress. I used my settlement to upgrade my home security and put the rest in savings. It felt like closure. I ran into Agent Watkins one last time at the grocery store in Mesa. She was off duty, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, but I recognized her immediately. "Mr. Jenkins," she said, smiling. "How are you doing?" "Good. Really good, actually. The neighborhood is back to normal, everyone's been compensated, and Patricia is in prison. It's the best possible outcome. I'm glad. Your case was one of the more satisfying ones I've worked." Usually, mail fraud is committed by strangers or organized crime. Having a trusted community leader exploit her position like that was particularly egregious. "You think she'll serve the full 8 years? With good behavior, she might get out in 6 or 7. But she'll have the supervised release after that, and the felony conviction will follow her for life. She'll never be able to hold a position of authority again." We talked for a few more minutes, then said our goodbyes. As I drove home, I thought about how one phone call from my bank had unraveled Patricia's entire scheme. It made me grateful for the systems and people who catch fraud, and it reminded me to stay vigilant about my personal information. The neighborhood continued to thrive under the new HOA leadership. Deborah and Marco proved that an HOA could actually be a force for good, organizing community events and handling disputes fairly. Property values in the neighborhood increased as word spread that the toxic HOA president was gone. People wanted to live in a community where they felt respected and safe. I eventually started dating Jennifer Atwood, a teacher who moved into the house Patricia used to own. It had been on the market for months because everyone in the neighborhood knew its history. But Jennifer was from Oregon and had no idea about the scandal until after she moved in. When I told her the story over coffee one morning, her eyes grew wider with each detail. "Wait, so the previous owner of my house was arrested for stealing your mail and went to federal prison?" she asked, incredulous. "Yep, for 8 years. And your house was sold to pay restitution to me and 8 other people." She burst out laughing. "That is the most Arizona story I've ever heard. Only in an HOA would someone commit federal crimes over lawn decorations." In her defense, it wasn't really about lawn decorations. It was about power and control. The mail fraud was just her method. "Still insane," Jennifer said, shaking her head. "But I'm glad she's in prison, and I got a great deal on this house." We laughed about it, but the experience had taught me valuable lessons. I learned to check my credit reports religiously, to verify my mail forwarding settings regularly, and to pay attention to who holds power in community organizations. I learned that abuse of authority can happen anywhere, even in suburban homeowners associations. Most importantly, I learned that standing up to bullies, even when they hold positions of power, is worth it. If I hadn't pursued the investigation, Patricia would have continued victimizing people indefinitely. By refusing to let her get away with it, I'd helped protect not just myself but 8 other families. The last piece of closure came 2 years after Patricia's sentencing. I received a letter forwarded through Agent Watkins. It was from Patricia, written from federal prison. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was surprisingly short and, as far as I could tell, sincere. Patricia wrote that she'd been attending therapy in prison and had come to realize how deeply she'd hurt people. She apologized for violating my privacy and causing me stress. She didn't make excuses or try to justify her actions. She simply said she was sorry and hoped that everyone she'd harmed could eventually find peace. I read the letter twice, then filed it away. I wasn't sure if I believed her remorse was genuine or if it was just part of her rehabilitation program. But it didn't really matter. Patricia was in prison, her victims had been compensated, and the neighborhood had moved on. Whether she felt genuine remorse or not didn't change any of that. The story became something of a legend in our community. New residents would hear about the HOA president who went to federal prison for mail fraud and ask if it was true. Deborah made it part of her standard welcome packet, explaining what had happened and what reforms the new HOA board had implemented to prevent anything similar from ever happening again. Transparency and accountability, she'd tell new residents. Those are the principles we operate on now. No more secret files, no more abuse of power, no more treating residents like subjects instead of neighbors. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a tense, hostile neighborhood under Patricia's reign became one of the friendliest communities in Mesa. People actually knew their neighbors now. Kids played in the streets without parents worrying about HOA violations for chalk drawings on the sidewalk. Holiday decorations went up without fear of fines. It was what a neighborhood was supposed to be. I eventually moved on from the whole experience emotionally, though it remained a good story to tell at parties. The fact that it had happened to me personally made it more impactful, but with time and distance, it became just another chapter in my life rather than a defining trauma. The relationship with Jennifer continued to develop, and she brought a fresh perspective to the neighborhood precisely because she hadn't lived through the Patricia era. She helped organize the annual block party, started a neighborhood book club, and generally contributed to the positive atmosphere Deborah and Marco had worked so hard to create. One evening, about 3 years after Patricia's arrest, I was walking my dog through the neighborhood when I ran into Frank Romano. He'd been one of the most vocal advocates for holding Patricia accountable, and his credit score had finally recovered from the fraud. "Lucas," he called out, waving me over. "You hear the news." "What news?" Patricia was denied parole. She applied after serving 4 years, but the parole board rejected her application. She's got at least 2 more years. I absorbed this information with mixed feelings. Part of me felt she deserved every day of her sentence. Another part of me wondered if 8 years was excessive for mail fraud, even systematic mail fraud. But mostly, I just felt indifferent. Patricia had become irrelevant to my life. "How do you feel about it?" I asked Frank. He considered the question. "Honestly, I don't care anymore. She's in prison, we got compensated, life moved on. Whether she serves 4 years or 8 years doesn't change what happened or how we've rebuilt this community." "Yeah, that's about where I am too." We talked for a few more minutes, then went our separate ways. That conversation crystallized something for me. The Patricia situation had truly ended. Not because she'd served enough time or shown enough remorse, but because she'd become irrelevant. The neighborhood had healed and moved forward without her. The last update I heard about Patricia came from Agent Watkins, who I'd stayed in occasional contact with. She called me about 4 years after the sentencing to let me know that Patricia had been released from federal prison after serving 6 years with good behavior. "She's on supervised release for the next 3 years," Agent Watkins explained. "She's required to live with her sister in Tucson, maintain employment, and she's prohibited from serving in any HOA or community organization capacity. She also can't live in an HOA-governed community during her supervised release." What happens after the 3 years? The prohibition on HOA involvement becomes a permanent condition of her sentence. She'll never legally be allowed to serve on an HOA board again. As for where she lives, that's up to her after supervised release ends, but I imagine most HOAs wouldn't want her anyway given her criminal record. "Do you think she'll reoffend?" Agent Watkins paused. "Most white-collar criminals don't reoffend, especially after serving significant prison time. But people who seek power and control often find other outlets. I hope prison changed her, but I honestly don't know." The conversation left me thoughtful. Patricia had paid her legal debt to society, but the consequences of her actions would follow her forever. She'd lost her house, her position, her reputation, and 6 years of her life. Whether she'd learned anything from the experience, only time would tell. Life in the neighborhood continued peacefully. The new HOA board maintained their commitment to reasonable governance and community building. Property values continued to rise. People moved in and out as people do, but the overall atmosphere remained positive. Jennifer and I got engaged during a hiking trip to Sedona. When we started planning the wedding, we decided to have the reception at the neighborhood community center, which had been renovated with HOA funds under Deborah's leadership. It felt right to celebrate our new beginning in a place that had also experienced its own transformation. Marco gave a toast at the reception that referenced the whole Patricia situation without explicitly naming her. "To Lucas and Jennifer," he said, raising his glass. "May your marriage be built on trust, respect, and absolutely no male fraud." Everyone who knew the story burst out laughing. Jennifer, who had heard the story many times by then, grinned and shook her head. The years passed, and the Patricia story gradually faded from daily conversation in the neighborhood. New residents who moved in after the scandal had no personal connection to it. For them, it was just an interesting piece of neighborhood history, like the time someone's pool flooded 3 backyards, or when a coyote wandered through during a block party. For those of us who lived through it, though, it remained a reminder of how quickly trust can be violated and how important accountability is in any organization. The HOA maintained strict oversight procedures and regular audits to ensure no one person could ever again accumulate the kind of unchecked power Patricia had abused. Deborah eventually stepped down as HOA president after serving 6 years, replaced by Thomas Chen, a retired accountant who brought the same commitment to transparency and community that Deborah had established. Marco remained on the board as treasurer, ensuring financial oversight was maintained. I ran into Patricia one time after her release, about 5 years after her sentencing. I was at a restaurant in Tucson visiting a client, and I saw her working as a hostess. She'd aged significantly, her blonde hair now fully gray, her face lined with stress and time. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw recognition and shame flash across her face. She quickly looked away and busied herself with menus. I didn't approach her. There was nothing to say. She was living her new reality, and I had moved on with my life. Whatever closure I needed, I'd found years ago. Jennifer noticed my distraction and followed my gaze. "Is that her?" she whispered. "Yeah. Do you want to leave?" "No, I'm fine. She's just a person now, not the monster she seemed like during all that." We had a pleasant dinner, and I didn't look in Patricia's direction again. When we left, I left a generous tip with the server, not for Patricia necessarily, but because I could afford to be generous. The settlement money, invested wisely, had grown significantly. Patricia's crimes had, in an ironic way, improved my financial situation. The drive back to Mesa that night gave me time to reflect on the entire experience from start to finish. What had begun with a phone call from my bank had spiraled into a federal investigation, criminal trial, civil lawsuit, and complete transformation of my neighborhood. One woman's abuse of power had exposed systemic weaknesses in HOA governance and led to meaningful reforms. But more than that, it had connected me with my neighbors in a way that might never have happened otherwise. The shared experience of being victimized by Patricia had created bonds that lasted years beyond the crisis. Marco, Deborah, Frank, and the others weren't just neighbors anymore. They were friends who had stood together against injustice and won. Jennifer and I settled into married life in the house where all this had started. The neighborhood remained a pleasant place to live, free from the harassment and manipulation that had characterized Patricia's reign. The HOA functioned as it should, handling practical matters without overreach, facilitating community without control. Sometimes I'd check my mailbox and remember that moment when my bank called to tell me about the address change. How one phone call had unraveled an entire criminal scheme. How refusing to accept the unacceptable had led to justice, not just for me, but for 8 other families. The story of Patricia Brennan and her mail fraud scheme became a cautionary tale about HOA governance, but it also became a story about community resilience. How neighbors could come together when faced with a common threat. How transparency and accountability could transform a toxic environment into a healthy one. How justice, though sometimes slow, could ultimately prevail. 10 years after the initial incident, I was sitting on my back patio watching my young daughter play in the yard. The neighborhood was hosting its annual summer block party that evening, and Jennifer was inside preparing food to bring. Life had moved on completely from the Patricia era. My daughter ran up to me, out of breath. "Daddy, Mrs. Martinez says you're a hero who caught a bad lady. Is that true?" I smiled at her innocent question. Deborah had clearly been telling stories again. "I don't know about hero, sweetheart. I just didn't let someone get away with doing something wrong." "What did she do wrong?" "She took things that didn't belong to her and used them to hurt people." My daughter's face scrunched up in concentration. "Like stealing?" "Yes, like stealing. And she went to jail?" "Yes, she did." "Good," my daughter declared with the absolute certainty of a 6-year-old sense of justice. Bad people should go to jail. If only all moral questions were that simple, I thought. But she wasn't wrong. Patricia had done bad things and she'd gone to jail. The system, imperfect as it was, had worked. As I walked with my daughter down to the block party that evening, I looked around at the neighborhood Patricia had once terrorized. Children played freely, decorations hung without fear of violation notices, and neighbors chatted comfortably with each other. The transformation was complete. Marco saw me and waved me over to the grill. "Lucas, come try my new recipe. I promise it won't give you food poisoning like that one time." "That was 7 years ago, Marco. Let it go." "Never," he said with a grin, handing me a burger. "Some things must be remembered forever. Speaking of which, you hear they're doing a documentary about HOA horror stories. They want to interview us about Patricia." "Hard pass." "That's what I told them," he agreed. "The last thing we need is more attention. We've moved on." And we had. The neighborhood had healed, grown, and thrived. Patricia's legacy wasn't the fear and control she'd tried to establish. Her legacy was the reforms she'd inadvertently inspired, and the community bonds she'd unintentionally strengthened through shared adversity. As the sun set over Mesa that evening, casting orange and pink light across the desert landscape, I felt genuinely grateful for how everything had turned out. Not grateful for what Patricia had done, certainly, but grateful for the strength and resilience the neighborhood had shown in response. Grateful for the friends I'd made and the justice we'd achieved together. The mail fraud scandal that had once dominated my life was now just a story, one chapter in the longer story of my life and this community. Patricia Brennan had tried to control us through fear and manipulation, but in the end, she'd only succeeded in bringing us closer together. Justice had been served, lessons had been learned, and life had moved on. That was the real ending to the story, not courtrooms or sentencing hearings, but this moment of peace and community on a warm Arizona evening, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, in a neighborhood that had found its way back to being a true community. The block party continued late into the evening, with laughter and conversation filling the air. My daughter played with other kids while Jennifer and I caught up with neighbors. It was ordinary and perfect, exactly what a neighborhood should be. And somewhere in Tucson, Patricia Brennan was living her supervised release, working her hostess job, dealing with the permanent consequences of her actions. I didn't wish her ill, but I didn't think about her much either. She'd become irrelevant, a cautionary tale rather than an active threat. The story that had begun with a phone call about redirected mail had ended here, with community, connection, and peace. Sometimes justice means prison sentences and restitution. But sometimes justice also means healing, moving forward and building something better than what existed before. That was the true victory over Patricia's attempted tyranny. Not that she'd been punished, though she had, but that we'd refused to let her poison our community permanently. We'd stood up, fought back, and ultimately created something better than what she'd tried to destroy. As I walked home that night with my family, I took one last look at the neighborhood street, lined with houses where people lived without fear of HOA harassment, where mail arrived safely and privacy was respected, where neighbors treated each other with decency and respect. This was what Patricia had tried to take away, and this was what we'd successfully defended. The neighborhood wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was ours, and it was good. That was enough.